You are asking to read the chords of the dead,
Sarn said, and did not move from the mouth of the keel where the marks are read.
You, a human, in the cluster where you counted Dako out of the world.
Yeah,
Hari said.
I am.
He had not come to Ahmed Hold lightly, and he had not come alone exactly. He carried two things that did not belong to the Vask, and a third that did. He carried a fired salvage Leeds stolen atlas. Every blank region the corporate combines had charted across the frontier, the densest cluster in the silence at its center. He carried a xenolinguist's proof that all of those silences were changing at once, in the same handful of recent years, all keeping a clock that was slowing down. And he carried a thing the Vask had given him, which was that he was the one human alive who had been marked by a keel mother's iron and named hold-touched, Mourned-Kin to Dako of this cluster, the living precedent for both a carrying and a receiving of a continuance. A Suul named Irie had pointed him here. The sixth voice had spent 2 years aiming him, and the asking when it came had been simple. The Suul understood the inherited tech was failing and could not fix what only invention could, and they wanted a human pointed at the changing center. Irie had given him the why. Irie could not give him the where to start. Only the Vask could. So Hari had flown back to Ahmed Hold, the drifting city of welded keels where he had counted his oldest friend out of the world, and it had been worse than he expected, and exactly what he expected. Both. He had not been back since Dako died. The cluster remembered him. The hold-touched human, the one Dako spent the last of his standing on. And that was its own weight, walking the chains between the marked hulls and feeling the keels turn toward him, some warm, some wary, the way Vesh had said they would be. He carried Korv on his hip the whole time, the multi-tool that bore the name of Dako's parent, and he did not say the name out loud, because some griefs you carry without speaking, and he had learned that from these people. He had come, in the end, to the keel where the marks are read, because that was where the records lived and where Dako had died, and because the woman who kept it was the one Vask in the cluster who would tell him the truth without softening it. Sarn had read Dako's marks at his death. She would not read Hari a comfortable lie now. Sarn did not say no. That was the first thing. She let him stand at the mouth of the keel where she had read Dako's marks, and she heard him out, because a hold-touched human asking was a thing the form had no rule against. Vesh of Tarek Hold had seen to that the day she set the iron in his hand. The trouble was the question, and Hari knew it before he opened his mouth.
I'm not going to ask who taught you the carrying,
He said.
Dako already told me. You don't know. It's older than the Vask, remember. You were taught it. You didn't make it. I'm not going to waste your grief asking a question you can't answer.
Sarn's close-set amber eyes did not change, but the long silence she left was a different quality of silence than before.
Then what?
Here was the whole thing, the invert, the lateral move that was the only move he had. He had spent his life misusing inherited tech by asking it the wrong question on purpose. He had watched a comms tender keep the maker's time by hand, and a relay tech reach a dead zone by echo, and a xenolinguist make 5 strangers rhyme. And every one of them had won by refusing the question everyone else asked and finding the question the thing could actually answer. The Vask could not tell him who made the carrying grammar, but the carrying grammar was not just a map, it was a log. Vesh had shown him that at Tarek Hold, when she read a change mark worked into a root knot that had not been there a year before, the grammar had a way to note when a kept place changed, the way the chord marks a death, which meant that every continuance the Vask had ever carried, every root tied around every silence for as long as they had been carrying their unborn past the kept places, was a dated observation of the kept places' behavior. Generations of them. A distributed record scattered across 100 holds of how the silences had behaved across the entire span of Vask memory, kept by a people who had no idea they were keeping it, because to them it was not science, it was grief. It was the carrying of their dead and their tomorrows, and the marks were just the marks.
You've been recording the silences for longer than the Accord's been alive.
Hari said.
Every hold, Every carrying, every change mark, anyone ever tied into a route. Because a kept place wasn't the same as the last time someone flew past it. You didn't know you were doing it. But it's the only long record of these places that exists anywhere in the galaxy. And the silences are changing now. All of them. Faster than they ever have. And I need to know if that's ever happened before. Because if it has, you survived it. And if you survived it, there's a way through.
It was not a small thing he was asking, and Sarn did not pretend it was. To read the carrying records of the keels was to be shown every hold's dead. The cords were not data, they were the carried lives of a people who carried everything. Their dead in witness knots, their grief in memorial tokens, their unborn in continuances, their dying in the reading of marks. To open the records to him was to make him a human, kin to all of it, not Mourned-Kin to Dako alone. Mourned-Kin to the whole carrying, every line, every hold, every death tied into every cord he read. The standing the keels had given him would stop being a precedent and become a debt. He would owe every dead Vask whose record he read, and the Vask did not let you read their dead for free.
You understand what you are asking to become.
Sarn said.
Not a guest of the keels. Not hold touched. If we open the cords to you, you are kin to every death in them. You will carry it. All of it. You do not get to set it down. The carrying does not end. It only ever passes on. And you are asking us to pass all of it, at once, to you.
I know.
Hari said, and he did, because he had been quietly becoming this for 2 years and had stopped pretending otherwise somewhere around the day Dako died, with his hand over Hari's on the tool that carried his parents' name.
I've got a Suul who spent 6 lifetimes of memory waiting for someone reckless enough to try a foolish thing instead of remembering a safe one. I've got a map of every grave on the frontier and a chorus of dead aliens singing back at a clock that's coming apart. Somebody's going to the center of that. It's going to be me. I'd rather go, knowing what your people learned the last time the silence stirred, than go ignorant and proud. Make me kin to it. I'll carry it.
Sarn did not decide it alone. No keel-warden would have. She put it to the cluster, and the cluster put it to other clusters. Because what Hari was asking touched every hold that it ever carried, and the keels argued it for 3 days in the weighted, unhurried way the Vask argued everything that mattered. Some keels blessing the name of the hold-touched human, some fearing it, exactly as Vesh had warned him at Tahrek Hold. In the end, it was the grievance that decided it. The oldest wound the Vask carried. The Accord had let their homeworld die and recorded their dead as recoverable property. And here was a human asking not to take from them, but to be entrusted with the deepest thing they had, the record of their dead, because it might be the only thing that could matter to the whole galaxy now. The people the Accord had thrown away would be the keepers of the galaxy's deepest knowledge. There was a justice in it the keels could not refuse. They opened the cords to him, and reading them cost exactly what Sarn said it would. He read for 9 days with Sarn teaching him the grammar 1 knot at a time, because the marks were not a language you could be handed. They were a thing carried, learned the way Ress had learned the shape of a reader from a wrench, the way the Vask learned everything that mattered, from hand to hand, with the grief spoken first. The grammar did not come easily, and Sarn did not pretend it would. A carrying cord was not written, it was knotted, and the knots were not letters but acts. This one a death witnessed, this one a continuance carried, this one a route flown, this one a debt that crossed between holds. And the same knot meant a different thing depending on the cord it sat in, and the knots to either side of it, the way a word means differently in different mouths. She taught him the way Ress had once been taught the shape of a reader from a wrench. Hand over hand, slow. The grief spoken before the fact. She would name a knot, make him find 3 more like it, and only when he could feel the difference between a death knot and a root knot blind, under his scarred fingers in the low keel light, would she let him move on. Before he was allowed to read a chord, Sarn made him hear whose it was. The first she laid in his hands belonged to a keel mother named Tay. Sarn would not let him touch the knots until he knew her, that she had carried 2 continuances in her life and lived to deliver neither, that the second she had carried a full year past hope because setting it down would have been a second death, that the cluster had marked her not for what she failed to bring, but for the carrying she did anyway. Only when Hari had sat with that, really sat with it, the specific, unbearable arithmetic of a woman who had held 2 tomorrows and buried both, did Sarn guide his fingers to the root knotted into the same cord, a wide dogleg around a silence on a lane Tay had flown 100 times, and a small hard knot near the end that Sarn named for him, a change mark. The year Tay first noticed the silence was not where it had been. The second cord belonged to a runner younger than Ress. Sarn made him hear the whole short life first, a kid who flew thin lanes because thin lanes were where a young Vask earned standing, who had been good at it, who had flown one thin lane too close to a quiet place on a dare no one admitted to afterward, and had not flown out. The cord was barely knotted. There had not been much life to record, but there was a route, and on the route a change mark in a different hand than the runner's, tied by whoever had flown out to read the marks where the lane went dark. The silence had stirred that year, just enough to pull a careless kid across a line. Hari held the short cord a long time. He had counted Dako out of the world in this cluster. He knew exactly what a barely knotted cord weighed. The third was not a person. The Vask did not separate the two the way humans did. It was a whole hold that had gone quiet in a bad year, its keels failing faster than its people could carry them, and had done the thing a dying hold does, given its keels away in order. Eldest grief first, parceling its dead among neighbor clusters so that no carrying would be dropped, the way Tarek Hold was doing now. The way Vesh had described to him with a steadiness that frightened him worse than weeping would have. The hold's record had been scattered across a dozen cords in a dozen clusters. Sarn had gathered the ones that mattered. Read together, they held a string of change marks close in time. The bad year had been a year a cluster of silences stirred at once, and a hold had died in the wash of it, and the survivors had carried the record outward in pieces so that even a hold's death would not lose what the hold had learned. He was not permitted to treat the cords as data. He was made to take each death into himself first, by name, and only then read the root knotted beside it. It was the slowest possible way to do science, and it was the only way the Vask would have allowed it. And somewhere in the middle of it, Hari stopped resenting the slowness and understood that the slowness was the point. That a record made of grief could only be read by grieving, and that the Vask had protected the truth of the kept places for 100 generations by making it impossible to learn without becoming kin to the cost. By the 4th day, he had stopped being able to keep the death separate from his own. That was the thing Sarn had warned him of, and the thing no warning could have readied him for. The cords did not stay outside you. He carried Tay now, and the young runner, and the dead of the quiet hold, the way he carried Dako and the name on the tool at his hip. Not as facts he had learned, but as weight he would set down only when he did, which was never. He slept badly when he slept. Sarn fed him and corrected his reading, and did not once tell him it would get easier, because it would not, and lying was not a thing the keel where the marks are read had any use for. On the 6th day, she told him he was reading like a warden. It was not a compliment. It was the highest thing she had ever said to him. Every cord was a death and a root, and sometimes, rarely, a change mark where a hold had noted that a kept place was not as it had been. He laid them in time, the way the linguist Anand had laid 5 recordings in time, and the long record of the silences assembled itself in front of him, generation by generation, across more years than united Earth had existed. It did not look like science when it assembled. It looked like a field of grief laid out in time. 100 generations of dead Vask in their cords, and scattered through them, rare as a particular kind of star, the change marks, the knots tied in the careful different way that meant a silence has moved. A kept place is not as it was. He walked the laid-out cords on his knees in the keel light, Sarn beside him naming what he could not yet read alone. And for the first time in the galaxy's history, The change marks of the kept places lay in a single line a person could travel with his eyes. Generation by generation, lifetime by lifetime, each not a year, some Vask had flown a little wider and lived. And the record said a thing that broke him a little and saved him a little in the same breath. The kept places had been silent for almost the entire span of Vask memory. Almost. Across all those generations, there were a handful of change marks. Rare, scattered, separated by lifetimes, a kept place stirring and then going quiet again before any Vask then living was born. The silence had stirred before. Small, slow, generations apart. And every time the Vask had read the change mark, tied it into the cord, flown around the place a little wider, and survived. They had carried their dead and their tomorrows right past a stirring silence, and lived, and the cord remembered it. The current change was not unprecedented. That was the hope. The silence had stirred before, and people had lived. The current change was also, by every measure in the cords, the largest and the fastest anyone had ever recorded. That was the rest of it. Whatever was happening now had happened before, but never like this, never this loud, never this quick. The Vask baseline gave him the only thread of hope in the whole galaxy and refused in the same record to tell him it would be enough. When it was done, he was kin to 100 holds dead, and he would carry them the rest of his life. And he had what no Suul memory and no reach inquiry and no human cleverness could have assembled. The first and only history of the question the whole galaxy was about to have to live beside. Not an answer, a history. The difference Hari was coming to understand between those two things was the whole human trade. On the last night, Sarn brought out the oldest cord in the cluster, older than the accord, older than the oldest grief any living Vask carried, kept in the deepest keeping of the keel. She laid it in his hands, and it was warm, the way a thing is warm that 100 hands have held.
This one is the oldest change we keep,
She said.
a silence that stirred and was carried around and went quiet again before any name in this cluster was a name. We were taught to carry around the kept places. We were taught what to do when one of them changes. You tie the mark, and you fly wider, and you live.
She looked at him with the close amber eyes that read a life off a body and said the thing that the whole history could not.
We were never taught what to do if one of them answered. No cord we keep has that knot. You are carrying a question we do not have the grammar for, hold touched. You are the 101st hand on this cord, and the first who is not flying around the silence. You are flying to it.
Harry held the warm old cord, kin now to every death tied into it, and the dead of 100 holes went with him toward the center. And he understood that the Vask had given him the only gift they had that the galaxy needed. Not an answer, never an answer, but the proof that the silence had stirred before, and people had lived through it. And the honest, unbearable admission that no one in all the caring had ever stood where he was about to stand, at the edge of a silence that had started this time to answer back.